Good morning, Grace and friends. Today's sermon from the second week in Eastertide, the week after Easter, is What About the Joy? Last week, we heard the Easter Gospel from Luke read by our four young ladies, Ava and Autumn, Ruby, and Naomi. They closed with the exclamation, "And they were happy." The room was filled by joy. Joy is one of the gifts of Easter. In today's continuing story of Easter in Luke, two disciples trudging forlorn to Emmaus are met by the risen Christ. They don't recognize he is until dinner time, when they saw him take the bread and break it and bless it like he had done so many times. Then they knew who he was. Then they go to tell the rest of the disciples. And as they are telling them what happened, the risen Christ appears to them all. They are filled with fright. They think he is a ghost, and no one wants to meet a ghost, even if it looks a little like Jesus. Jesus then showed them his hands and feet and invited them to touch him, as he had done for Thomas in the Gospel of John. Their response is worth pondering for a moment. One translation says, they disbelieved for joy and wondered. Joy, disbelief, wonderment, all at once. There are moments, maybe many moments, when our hearts feel several things at once, like joy and sorrow at funerals, hope and doubt together. So here, joy, disbelieving, and wondering. Emily Dickinson, no fan of the overly certain New England brand of religion, wrote to a friend, "We both believe and disbelieve 100 times an hour, which keeps our believing nimble." The resurrection event keeps our believing nimble, and part of it is joy. Jesus came, he said to the disciples and to us, that we may have joy, and that the joy would be overflowing. My sermon title, What About the Joy, comes from a lecture I heard recently by Davidson religion professor Carl Plank. The lecture was in honor and memory of our mutual friend, Tony Abbott, who taught poetry and literature at Davidson. Carl recalled a time before when he was lecturing his students about Jesus' one-verse parable in Matthew. Tony was sitting in the back of the classroom. The parable goes like this: "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all he has and buys the field." As the lecture was ending and the students filing out, Tony yelled from the back of the room with an impish grin on his face, "What about the joy, Carl? What about the joy?" Carl realized that he had indeed given scant attention to the joy part of the parable, that in his joy the person went and sold all he had. Joy is part of the treasure buried in the field, sometimes in our own backyard. Joy is what comes from the kingdom within. We may, because of the madness and cruelty and pain of the world around us, or because what has happened to us, distrust joy, disbelieve it, guard our hearts against it, because we are afraid of another disappointment. But poet Mary Oliver guides us well in the poem, "Don't Hesitate." If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give into it. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Joy is the gift of God, not only to us in the happiest of moments, but also in the darkest of circumstances. People have sung joy in times of slavery, exile, oppression, of injustice and ill fortune. Sometimes joy is a choice we make, and as we make it, the joy begins to grow. The poet Lee Young writes, "We wander the roof of hell, choosing blossoms." Dorothy Thompson, the acclaimed American journalist during World War II, she, by the way, was the only journalist to interview Hitler, wrote of her friend in France who maintained a serene happiness in the face of great misfortune. She said her friend displayed what she called the most beautiful form of courage, the courage to be happy. The poet Jack Gilbert wrote, "We must risk delight. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the endless furnace of the world." What might it mean for us to give in to joy, to risk delight, to let ourselves feel our gladness? We may ask, what are things that keep us from joy? Brene Brown says that we need to live with a strong back and soft front. A strong back has to do with the courage of keeping our values, of being truly ourselves, and of good boundaries. A soft front or soft tummy has to do with making ourselves vulnerable and taking off the armor. An armored heart steels itself against so much, including joy. Brene Brown writes that vulnerability is, in her words, the birthplace of love, joy, trust, intimacy, and courage. Some people live with a strong back and an armored front. Some live with a weak back and a weak front. But the key is a strong back and a weak front. And a wild heart, she adds, like the man who went and sold all that he had to buy the field. It's what the phrase in the benediction points to, the grace to risk something big for something good. Sometimes because of big mistakes we have made in life, we don't think we deserve joy. Sometimes the blows we have suffered in life make us suspicious of joy, even cynical about it. But the psalm says, "Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning." Easter morning is the joy that comes with the morning. A minister was giving a children's sermon on Easter morning. A child raised her hand and asked, "What is resurrection?" That's a pretty big word for a child. The minister paused, then answered, "Easter means when you think it's all over, it's not all over. That is joy." Joy is not determined by conditions. Brother David Steindl-Rast says, "Joy is a happiness that doesn't depend on what happens. It is a deep form of happiness close to what we might call a deep contentment." Joy is also communal. It is contagious. So let's think about the joy we experience when we're together. The French sociologist of religion in the early 20th century, Émile Durkheim, called it collective effervescence. If laughter is, as Anne Lamott says, carbonated holiness, communal joy is collective effervescence. Sometimes it happens in worship, during a song, or like last week when our girls read the Easter Gospel. And it's not just a church thing. God is not stingy with joy. It happens at sports events or at concerts. Some of us experienced it recently when we went to see Ruby and Naomi and Annie. Parents and friends filled the auditorium to watch our children perform. Joy abounding. So how can we increase our joy? Show up for times of joy, like potluck dinners or Grace's annual scary supper or birthday parties or weddings. How we have missed such events in these past 2 years. Paul exclaimed, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." Why did he need to say it twice? Because every day we need to be called to joy. And he put his finger on one of the things that stifles our joy: anxiety and worry. He writes, have no anxiety about anything, pardon me, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, he added, make your requests known to God. Paul was no stranger to anxiety. He was, by his own confession, a nervous wreck at times in his anxiety for the churches. He was, in fact, in jail when he wrote these words. He had reasons not to be joyful. Worry can kill joy for sure. Regrets over the past and anxiety about the future can rob us of the present and rob us of joy. Another thing that can kill joy is sitting in the critic's chair too long. Our media-flooded world is an opinion machine. I saw a poem entitled Joy. It goes like this: joy, any moment minus our opinion of it. God is not requiring you to have an opinion about everything. If a person comes to you brandishing an opinion, you don't have to get into a battle of opinions. It's okay to say something like, I don't have an opinion on that. So let's return to Jesus' parable. The person unexpectedly finds the treasure and in his joy goes and sells all he has to buy the field. What do we need to let go of, to sell off, so that we can have the treasure of joy? What attachments do we have that bring us misery? The Buddha said that it is our attachments in life that bring us misery and suffering. We can get attached to things. Our things can begin to control us. We can be attached to unhealthy ways of relating to other people. We can become attached to negative emotions like grievance or envy, or to wrong thoughts or ideas. A Buddhist saying that I've seen on a bumper sticker goes, don't believe everything you think. I need that some days. It's amazing how God gives people in great difficulty and adversity joy. Joy makes a hard day good. Robert Coles, in his multi-volume work, Children of Crisis, discovered the joy in the lives of children of poverty. Joy keeps hope alive. About a year ago, I was full of worry and had not slept well. As Sue and I were having coffee on our back patio, suddenly we saw a giant blue heron fly from our left to our right all along the creek in front of us. It felt like God just showed up. Everything was going to be okay. Joy. In Wendell Berry's poem, Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, he writes, "Expect the end of the world. Laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. Practice resurrection." Resurrection means joy too. Practice it. When it happens, what a mystic called the merriment of heaven comes down. When it happens, the joy of the kingdom within bubbles up to the surface. What about joy? What about the joy, Carl? Tony asked. Don't forget the joy. That may be God's message to us today. Amen.